Hi everyone, my name is Alexander Zalivako, and I'm the founder of From A to Z law firm. One of the areas of our expertise are sanctions, and in a series of presentations called Sanctions 360 Degrees, we will look into major sanctions economic regimes and the way they affect the lives of private individuals and corporations. Thank you very much for watching. We will expand the geographical scope of our series Sanctions 360 to the Horn of Africa, and we'll discuss today Somalia, and more specifically, as we always do in our geographical resumes of the national and international economic sanctions regimes, we would briefly discuss the historical and political background of the country with a view to explain the historical, geopolitical, and economic roots of the current sanctions regime, try to put them into the perspective, and then we would briefly summarize the key principles where sanctions affect today, dealing with Somalia, and one may say this is one of those few examples where international and national sanctions seem to be in principle aligned and aimed at restoring, although one may certainly argue unsuccessfully, peace and security in the region. It's important to go into the historical background of Somalia, a large country geographically located at the key crossroads of international trade, to understand why the country, which from the objective perspective had all opportunities to become a prosperous and developed nation, ultimately is experiencing an ongoing violence, war conflicts, basically starting from at least the fall of Siad Barre's regime, early 90s, and probably when going a little bit earlier back to the unsuccessful war with Ethiopia. Prior to the colonial rule in the region, Somalians as a people were living across the Horn of Africa in what was subsequently divided between colonial nations into artificially created areas controlled by them, and accordingly what was a single people was divided between, in part, French-controlled Djibouti, the British Somaliland, which is marked on this map in green and located in the north of Somalia, and then the rest of the country, which is marked here in yellow and down in red to the south, which became Italian Somaliland. But equally, a substantial part of Somali people were the residents of Ethiopia, a huge Ogaden region located basically in the part which we see in between the green part and the red part in Ethiopia, is populated mostly by Somalian people, as well as in the north of Kenya, close to the South Somalian border, where again, people living in that area are Somalians, and they've historically associated themselves with a wider or greater Somalian nation. So that artificial division between colonial states, as well as the subsequent exacerbation of clans rivalry, often used by the colonial powers to create contradictions between various clans, created the, let's say, historical base for the future ongoing conflicts in the region. Nevertheless, despite this historical background, when Somalia became independent, both parts of the British and Italian Somalia decided to unite and to form a single state. And since very beginning, it was a successful democratic process in the country, including 2 rounds of elections where the sitting and founding president of Somalia was defeated and peacefully transferred the power to the incumbent president. So this seemed originally, following the independence, that this colonial background could be overcome and a successful development based on democratic process could be established in the country. Unfortunately, the divisions were profound, and the period of democratic transition and development was short-lived. This was exacerbated by unclear circumstances leading to the assassination of the then incumbent president and the military coup, which was made by the General Siad Barre, who took control of the country, originally positioning himself as a technocrat who would bring an end to the clans rivalry dividing the country and would develop the country on a science-based objective basis, trying to forge it into a single nation. And again, despite this military background of Siad Barre coming to power, he was successful at the beginning, introducing important modernizing reforms, which reformed the education, for example, in the country. But these historical divisions of Somalians in between 5 countries, out of which only 2 managed to reunify following the end of colonial period, unfortunately, has always followed the political discourse in the country, where the aggressive or assertive position towards the minorities living in neighboring countries and some sort of independence, autonomy, or even reunification with the Somalia always dominating the political discourse. And this development of Somalia, development of its army, of its military potential, unfortunately, created the impression of Siad Barre that he would be able to unite Somalians by force, which resulted in a war with Ethiopia at the end of the 70s, where Somalia, at the end of the day, was defeated by Ethiopia, creating a humanitarian catastrophe with the exodus of Somalians from Ogaden region in Ethiopia, certainly substantial damage to the economy of Somalia, as well as the overall exclusion of Somalia, the country which was the aggressor in that war, from the international relationships. And this, rather than bringing the end to the rule of Siad Barre, conversely, resulted in tightening up of his regime, exacerbation of authoritarian, or one may say even dictatorial trends in the country, exacerbation of ethnic conflicts, which resulted in the civil war and bombardments made by the southern part of the country where Siad Barre was located and ruling from, as to the northern part of Somalia, creating the rift which persists even today between Somaliland and the rest of Somalia. The situation went from bad to worse, and in 1991, Siad Barre was forced to leave the country. This even further exacerbated the vacuum. unsuccessful intervention of the United Nations in early 90s, unfortunately, failed to restore peace. And since then, international community, United Nations, and the local operators like the African Union certainly pay close attention to the ever ongoing humanitarian catastrophe exacerbated by the spread of terrorism and overall radicalization of the groups in the country, but very little is done in practice to bring an end to this circle of instability, power vacuum, which is often then filled in by local militia. So in essence, what we see in the region is that apart from Somaliland, this northern area, which we see on this map in green, which de facto became independent since 1991 and managed to assert a sort of at least security in its area. The remaining part of the country is torn by various clans, militia groups, and starting from the spread of international terrorism and its proximity to the hotspots of those movements, also the global security issues. So from that perspective, the focus of the international economic sanctions with respect to this region has been, as it's in fairness supposed to be, the restoration of peace and security, bringing of minimum stability to the country, cut off the supply routes for the arms and chemicals which may be used for the construction of improvised explosive devices by the local terrorist groups. In essence, bringing a semblance of peace and statehood to the country. And here we can see the main UN resolutions which document the current sanctions regime applicable with respect to Somalia. Obviously, the key part of the regime is the arms embargo. Following the departure of Siad Barre and the, in effect, civil war erupting in Somalia, the UN Security Council imposed a comprehensive arms embargo with respect to Somalia, as there was no, in effect, central government, which at that time would be able to restore peace and security in the country. And the focus of international community was, in essence, to cut off all players in the country from the supply of arms and the components for the production of explosive devices. Further, this general arms embargo was lifted, so for the time being, there is no restriction on the supply of weapons to the federal government of Somalia, but the restrictions persist in respect of the, first of all, terrorist groups operating in the regions where a complete arms embargo is in place, and that's today, in effect, is the focus of international sanctions regime applicable to Somalia. The focus is to cut off Shabab, which is in control of the substantial parts of territory in the south of the country, from the supply of weapons. And the second element of the arms embargo is to cut off the same groups from the ability to construct improvised explosive devices, which is the main machinery and the main method by which they attack the civilian populations as well as military bases of the federal government of Somalia in the region. So there is a comprehensive ban on the supply of components which can be used in their production to the country, as well as a limited arms control mechanism remains in place, which applies to the supply of arms to the federal member states of Somalia, as well as private security contractors operating in the regions. So arms embargo and compliance with arms embargo is by far the most important element, and the reason is quite obvious. Somalia is indeed a country which is subject to a chronic, ongoing military conflict, which is fueled certainly by a continuous flow of arms in the country. In addition to arms embargo, the international sanctions include a further asset freeze and travel ban sanctions. So that's a standard tool, which is a part and parcel of almost any UN sanctions regime, where targeted individuals and organizations are put on the UN sanctions list by the relevant committee responsible for the administration of the Somalian sanctions. And those are subject to comprehensive asset freeze and travel ban in all UN member states. A specific feature of international economic sanctions applicable to Somalia is targeting the charcoal supplies of Somalia. Charcoal is one of the main exporting commodities of the country, as well as a source of potential revenues for financing the operations of Al-Shabaab or ISIL Somalia in the region. So there is a UN control over the charcoal, and this control in effect prohibits any type of dealing except if expressly authorized by the UN Security Council Committee. As to the national regimes of the key jurisdictions, which we typically look at during our series, being the United States, the UK, and the European Union, the national sanctions regimes in principle are aligned and are aimed at implementing the UN sanctions and apply to blocking at the national level the assets of the UN bloc persons, as well as those persons which are listed by the national member states in their own name, where the practice is different, and specifically the United States, for example, had a substantial number of their own designates to the list. In addition to this, as we have already observed with respect to other jurisdictions in the region, most noteworthy Yemen, for example, a substantial part of restrictions, specifically in the United States, come from the sanctions regime, which do not deal with Somalia as a country, but which are rather aimed at addressing the particular subject matter issues. With respect to the Somalia, the most relevant would be counterterrorism, sanctions regime of the United States. And we see many designations on those lists which are relevant for Somalia. And by way of example, Al-Shabaab is listed both on Somalia specific sanctions regime, but also on the US counterterrorism regime as a foreign terrorist organization or the specially designated global terrorist person. Thank you very much for watching. I trust that you found this presentation useful, and I hope to see you during my next presentations.